Hello and welcome to the TRT World Forum 2020. This is the first session. I am Dr. Bora Bayraktar and I'm going to host this session, which is very important. And recently we have witnessed really dramatic changes. We have very distinguished guests today. Before I introduce them, I just want to inform everyone, especially our speakers, about our rules. I'll give you 6 to 8 minutes before we start. After first speeches, we will go to discussion. So, as most of us here, we have spent most of our lives to cover what's happening in the Middle East, especially in Israeli-Palestinian question. And when I go back and think about my career, I started in 1990s covering peace process. Then in 20s, it was the time of Palestinian Intifada. Then for the last 10, maybe 15 years, we witnessed unilateral actions from the sides, especially from Israel. So I ask each of my guests to comment about where we are in the line of history and what is the direction of change, what we are going to witness in 2020s. So I want to give the floor, first of all, His Excellency Marwan Muasher, former Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bora. Let me say that with the Biden win in the United States, what we can expect at least is the stopping of the deterioration in the peace process and the putting aside of the Trump plan, which would have really killed the two-state solution. That's the first major development that we can expect. I don't think we can expect the Biden administration to launch a major effort, though, to revive the peace process. I think the new administration is going to be preoccupied with a lot of domestic priorities, COVID-19, repairing the rift between U.S. society, repairing the relationship with the European Union, having a new relationship with China, and maybe even re-examining the deal with Iran. I think the Arab-Israeli conflict is going to come at a very low priority for the new administration. This is the second point I want to make. The third point I want to make is what is happening between Israel and several Arab states, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates in particular. A lot of people are calling them peace agreements. I would not call them peace agreements. These are bilateral agreements done for purely bilateral interests between the two countries and between Israel. For the first time, an agreement with Israel is not about land for peace. It is just about peace for peace. And I'm afraid that in doing so, the Israeli public and certainly the Israeli government might get the false impression that they don't need to come to terms with the Palestinians if they can forge agreements with the Arab states that don't require Israel to withdraw from any part of Arab territory. And therefore, I think that these agreements are going to further kill the two-state solution, which is, you know, the cornerstone of international efforts to solve the conflict. So where are we heading from here? If there is no serious effort, and I don't believe there will be, on part of the US administration to revive the peace process, if Israel will continue to annex land anyway, if not de jure, then de facto, and by doing so, kill the two-state solution, I think that we are moving into an era where the focus of the conflict is going to shift from people focusing on the shape of a solution to people focusing on equal rights, particularly among the Palestinians. If the Palestinians become convinced that a two-state solution is not possible on Palestinian soil, then the only way forward for them, in my view, is to insist on equal political rights in the area they live on, in areas controlled by Israel. That is going to be the question that the international community will have to answer. Because today we are in a one-state reality. It's not a one-state solution, but it is a one-state reality. It just happens to be an undemocratic reality for the Palestinians. And if the Palestinians become convinced there is no future, there's no horizon for a Palestinian state, a credible Palestinian state, not the kind of state that was talked about in the Trump plan, but a credible Palestinian state, then the Palestinians are going to start pushing for a rights-based approach and not for what shape of a solution might come about. The international community in this case is not going to be able to say no to a Palestinian state and no to equal rights indefinitely. That means only one solution: yes to apartheid. And I think that nobody in this time and age is going to accept an apartheid solution where people who will form a majority very soon in Israel. In fact, today the Palestinians are a plurality in Israel. 6.9 million Palestinians versus 6.6 million Israeli Jews live on the land between the river and the sea. And so in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, when the Palestinians are a clear majority, the international community will not be able to deny equal rights to the Palestinians. A two-state solution today cannot be just empty rhetoric. The international community cannot just keep talking about a two-state solution and do nothing to affect its implementation. What that means, in my view, is that Israel is just going to have more time available to annex more land, to create more facts on the ground, and to kill the very idea of a two-state solution. This is where I believe the conflict is going to be heading in the next phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muasher. Really, it was an important opening. You say a two-state solution is still something that we should follow as international community, but the facts on the ground have changed. By the way, don't worry about the names. There are some issues. We are trying to fix it. I want to turn to Mr. Levy from Haaretz. You have been writing so long about the peace process, then the Intifada, what's happening in the Israeli domestic politics. So what is your take on, sir? How do you see the recent situation when we are heading towards 2020s?
Thank you very much for having me. The good news are that Donald Trump was not elected. The bad news are that Joe Biden was elected. And we face, in many ways, a new reality in the Middle East. But I'm not sure that I can agree to the timetable that His Excellency Mr. Muasher had described here. I think, Mr. Muasher, that the two-state solution not only is dead, I'll say more than this, it was never born. I do believe that there was never an Israeli statesman, an Israeli prime minister, who really genuinely meant to put an end to the occupation. They always spoke about an easing the occupation, doing it more easy and more comfortable, but never ending it. There was not one Israeli statesman who really was ready to give the Palestinians full rights, and obviously a sovereign state like any other state, like Jordan, like Israel, like Turkey. This was never on the table, and we have to realize it. And this is maybe one of the most important things for now on, is to realize that the occupation is not a temporary phenomena. It is there to stay, and it is here to stay from day one. There was never an intention to put an end to it. We have to face it. We might like it, we might hate it like I do, but that's reality. Now the question is, where do we go from here? And we are facing really a certain kind of crossroad. One way is to continue to speak about the two-state solution while knowing that this train left already the station and will never be back. 700,000 Jewish settlers, the most powerful political group in Israel, who is going to evacuate them? And if you don't evacuate them, what kind of Palestinian state will you have? What does it mean, a state with all kind of Bantustans connected with bridges and tunnels and canals and I don't know what? This is not a viable state, and it will not hold, and it's not a just solution. And without a just solution, it will not hold. So if we really face reality, the only option on the table right now is the one state, as Mr. Muasher rightly said so. The one state is existing now for 53 years. It's not a new invention. We are living in one state. The Green Line is dead for a long time ago. The only problem is the regime of this state. And the struggle must focus from now on the regime of this state, because this state is going to stay either as an apartheid state or as a democracy. There is no third way. And the world, yes, the world, who was so efficient and so active about the first apartheid state, South Africa, has to recruit itself to face the second apartheid state, namely Israel. If the occupation would have been temporary, I would say it's not an apartheid state because we regained full democracy in Israel. But as it is not a temporary phenomenon, after 53 years, it's hard to say it's temporary. We have to face it that this is the reality. Now, will the world live with a second apartheid state? I don't know. We have to realize that right now the Palestinians are in the worst condition ever since 48. They were never so divided, so weak. The Arab world is going to a new direction. At least part of the Arab world is going for new interests and new directions, as we see in the Middle East. Europe and the United States never did too much for the rights of the Palestinians. Israel learned to live with all the condemnation of the EU and the State Department. It was always hollow. After 10 American presidents and 53 years of occupation, nobody can really believe that Joe Biden will be the man who will put an end to the occupation in this reality, in this context. This is obviously ridiculous. If Barack Obama didn't do it, nobody is going to do it. And therefore, we must focus now to a new discourse, to a new way of struggle, I believe, namely to start now, Mr. Muasher, not to wait until we will realize that the two-state solution is dead, because it was never born. We have to start to speak about equal rights. This will be the one and only challenge, first of all, for Israel, and secondly, for the world. Would Israel say no to the equal rights idea, which it will, then Israel declares itself officially and formally as an apartheid state. And then it is the challenge of the world, of the Arab world, of the Western world, of all over the world, to decide how do we accept a second apartheid state. Would Israel say yes, which it will not, then we have really a beginning of a new reality, really a vision, really a dream which might come true one day. Let's not exclude it. I know that today it sounds to many people as an utopia, and it is an utopia. But let's start somewhere, and that's the only way to see some light by the end of the road. A democracy, equal rights between Palestinians and Jews in one state. As much as it sounds now far-fetched, it's the only open way for any kind of justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. Actually, both of our speakers are talking about admitting the reality of end of two-state solution, or as Mr. Levy put it, maybe it was never been there. Actually, when the peace process started, both sides had different opinions. Arafat and PLO was looking for an independent Palestinian state, while Israel was after security arrangements, obviously. So I want to move Mr. Ahmad Azzam. He's the head of strategic affairs unit of the Prime Minister's office of the Palestinian state. Mr. Azzam, what is your take on this? Let's hear your opinion about that. Where we are in the line of history, what is your opinion, and what is the direction of change? The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Bora. Thank you for TRT for inviting me. Actually, I would like to start from the title of your conference, Shifting Dynamics, the International Order in Post-Pandemic World. Actually, the concept shifting dynamics is a concept that I heard last week several times. I heard it from several EU diplomats, different politicians who are thinking that we are living now a new dynamic in the Middle East and in the world, not only in the and especially in the Middle East, and that the peace, the Arab Israeli agreements, they are a new dynamic. Also, going to the president-elect Biden and his let me say, all the documents he announcing, all the announcements he's making, you can hear the word resetting all the time: resetting, rebalance, rescuing. So we are now about two questions: a new dynamic, resetting. For Palestinians, actually, the both are not what they are really wish. The new dynamic, according to how I understand it, we should go to the 14th of September 2020, when the oil constructions in Saudi Arabia were targeted. At that time, President Trump made an announcement that they will not intervene, that we are no more dependent on the oil of the Middle East. Therefore, it seems there's a kind of withdrawal, American withdrawal. It seems there are a kind of a vacuum in the Middle East. So at this moment, we can see this is the real new dynamic that maybe leads some regional countries to start a new dynamic in the Middle East. Israel is almost preparing itself to be more central to the region, to play a bigger role. Some Arab countries think that since the US is withdrawing from the area, we should start our own planning. Resetting, going to Biden, who is announcing clearly that there is no withdrawal from the Middle East. Also, if coming to the Palestinian point of view, or Palestinian dimension of all this resetting and new dynamics processes, going back to resetting, or going back to the old American mechanism, away from Trump mechanism that wanted a kind of conflict resolution, but on the base of ending the idea of Palestinian independent state. I'm sure we don't speak about equal rights. We don't speak about one state with equal rights. We are speaking about Bantustans for Palestinians. This deal that hopefully it's ended now. Nevertheless, building settlements and colonies every day on the ground is actually making it happening also. So going back now, looking at the old paradigm, the American paradigm, it's the paradigm of conflict management. it's the conflict management that there should be a kind of peace process, not necessarily peace. This is maybe the best, actually, what previous American administration did. According to our understanding, according to my understanding for Biden's administration, Palestinians are not a priority. Even trying to solve the problem according to the old American parameters is not really a priority. So, but even if we manage to get the Palestinians to be priority again, I think it's a problem if we will go to the idea of conflict management again, to have peace process without a clear conditions or a clear path to reach peace, not only a peace process. So in this way, it's important to understand that Palestinians need not really resetting process, not the new dynamic, the current new dynamic. We need a kind of paradigm shift. We need to redesign things again, and this is not only will be solved through the United States of America. The Palestinian side have three major options. The first option is that to start negotiations under multilateral international umbrella, Quartet Plus, or the UN, or whatever. The second option can be going back to negotiations, negotiations as it stopped in 2014, and starting from there, starting from releasing the prisoners or Palestinian prisoners, and the third option is that Israel should committed itself to the signed agreements. We have more than 20 agreements signed with Israel that Israel is not committed itself to it. So we need to go back to this. This should not be addressed only to the United States of America. I think the whole international community should think about a new paradigm. For example, when you are saying you are balanced between Israel and the Palestinians, it is not balanced if you are saying you are supporting two-state solutions, but you don't recognize the two states. If you are recognizing Israel and you are balanced, you should recognize the Palestinian state. So this is one item that we should focus on in the next few months and in the coming period. Also, there is no balance between occupier and occupied. So the idea of that international community is balanced need to be changed, and the definition of balanced position should be defined again. You cannot ask Palestinians to keep giving peace initiatives. Palestinians accepted to have a state on the 22% of their historical land. So actually, the occupier who should be asked to provide first of all its peace initiative, and also to provide a map. Where is the borders of Israel? Actually, Palestine believe that and depends on friends and who believe in justice and peace, and believe that leaving a problem like the Palestinian question without solving it, it's really will have a long-term consequences on the peace in the region and on stability in the world in general. We think that to solve a problem like Palestine is a very essential thing. However, Palestinians, I will end by saying, nevertheless, we know that the Trump administration has a proposal to end the whole idea of the Palestinian sovereign state, and not suggesting one state with equal rights for all citizens. But we think we are still on the ground. We will having any agreement with any Arab countries. This will not solve the problem. Any Israeli politician will wake up in the morning. We will find us Palestinians on our land. We will be here all the time. Starting from the 1950s, the Palestinian national movement main slogan and main principle is to empower ourselves, to empower national empowerment. So we will continue on the ground. We will continue here, and I think the whole international community need to think that leaving such a question without solving it have a very serious long-term consequences. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Azzam. Once I heard from former PLO leader Arafat, he was talking about Ardus Salam, or land of peace, or Terra Santa. So if there is no peace here, no peace in the world. So for the last 100 years, unfortunately, we have more wars than peace eras in the region. So thank you very much for these speeches. Thank you very much for limiting your speech and very compact statements you have made. Especially, I want to underline two-state solution looks like no more. So in the next decade, we will be talking about new paradigm, and all of the discussant speakers talk about international community, other actors should involve more to find a solution. Now I want to open our session to discussion. Again, thank you very much for joining us. We have very distinguished speakers, discussants here. I want to give the floor, first of all, Mr. Azzam Tamimi. He is a very well-known academic and activist. The floor is yours, sir.
If there is anything good really about Trump, is that his term in office has dispelled whatever remained of illusions about the reality of the conflict in Palestine. This conflict was never about two communities who are unable to settle a dispute over land or resources. This is a conflict that emanated from an invasion from abroad that dispossessed the Palestinians, and that has been trying to establish a regime that claims that Jews have superior rights to everybody else, and according to this claimed divine right, they can take my mother's house, my father's land, and throw me out, and the rest of the Palestinians. And I think now there is a clearer vision of what's likely to happen. There will never be peace so long as there is an apartheid regime in the heart of the Arab world, led by Zionism. And the Arab masses that took to the streets in late 2010, early 2011, understood this very clearly. Their slogans were they wanted a regime change in their own countries, and they wanted Palestine to be liberated. And that's why over the past 10 years, we've seen an alliance between Israel on the one hand and what remains of despotic regimes in the Arab world on the other hand, because both parties feel threatened by a popular uprising that demands freedom and dignity for the Arab people. We've seen for the first time, or maybe in clearer terms than ever before, we've seen Arab freedom and dignity on the same platform as Palestinian freedom and dignity. Actually, Palestine will probably never be free, and the Palestinians will never be free until the Arab peoples are free. And hence is the current wave of normalization of relations between despotic regimes in the Gulf and Israel, because this is a camp that has been forming against the Arab masses. So to conclude, what I see, what I expect will happen in the future, we are going to see a clearer polarization into two distinct camps. The camp that has on one side Zionism and despotism in the region, because Zionism is aligning itself with dictatorship, not with democracy. And on the other hand, the peoples of the region who want to see democracy, who want to see freedom and dignity, and freedom and dignity will pave the way for the liberation of Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tamimi. This is also an important point of view. So Palestinian destiny is bound with the Arab destiny in general. This is what you have underlined. So maybe we can talk about these agreements, Abraham Accords with Israel. So I realize, I understand from your points that Arab nations may not be happy with the agreement. Maybe regimes are signing this. So do you think any of the discussants can answer? Maybe Mr. Black, you could talk about it. Do you think these agreements are sustainable for UAE and others?
So I don't think that the agreements between the UAE and Bahrain do anything remotely to resolve the Israel-Palestine question. I think that the Gulf states and Sudan, to a lesser degree, it's less clear what is happening from Khartoum. But the Gulf states in particular are pursuing their self-interest. They're wanting to please the Trump administration. The Biden administration is not going to undo these bilateral agreements, of course, just as he isn't going to undo the Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which, as we all know, is one of the most sensitive issues that remain to be resolved at the center of the conflict. But I wouldn't dismiss the Abraham Accords as meaningless, because they do appear to break the taboo of Arab recognition of Israel, normalization with Israel, which has been, since the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative that was unveiled at the height of the Second Intifada. So they do nothing to resolve the Palestine issue. But I really want to ask the Gideon Levy and Azzam Tamimi if they have a workable strategy for achieving a one-state solution with equal rights for the Jews and Arabs who live between the river and the sea. Because I don't see myself any workable alternative to a two-state solution for this most intractable of conflicts. I'd be really interested to hear if any of the speakers have a plan, a strategy, regardless of what external pressure is applied to Israel, in terms of the Palestinian people and the Israeli people, who, whether you like it or not, are two nations, separate but not equal, whether anybody has a strategy for achieving a one-state solution. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Black, thank you very much. Before we get the answers from Mr. Levy and Azzam, let's also hear from Her Excellency Ayşe Sözen Usluer. She also wants to make a statement. Then we will get the answer from to our speakers. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all, Maman. I'm in the region for the last 3 years, and I would like to make my contribution from a regional perspective. During the passing 4 years, we witnessed a change of game with regard to Israeli-Palestinian conflict under the presidency of Trump. And one leg of this game is the termination of Middle East peace process, where two parties were included, and unilateralism started to dominate the process. And second leg is that the traditional actors of Middle East peace process were replaced, namely Egypt and Jordan, were replaced by the Gulf countries. And access created by Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, plus Bahrain and Egypt are the complementary partners, started to play a prominent role for this new strategy in the region. Normalizing relations with Israel has been taken as a critical step to pursue this policy. However, we can talk about two categories in the region, two categories of countries in the region. One category agrees with the Trump administration, totally agrees with the Trump administration, and eventually signed the agreements. Second category, on the other hand, considered the agreements unilateral, excluded the Palestinians, obviously, and undermines the two-state solution. So the countries like Qatar and Oman can be cited in the latter category. I think none of the countries in the Gulf would object normalizing relations with Israel. However, the second category that I mentioned would rather prefer to remain loyal to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, where they decided to normalize relations with Israel only after peace achieved between Palestine and Israel. Indeed, according to this initiative, which was also endorsed by all OIC members, normalization was going to work as a motivation for Israel to compromise with the Palestinians, and it was going to be a kind of tool. Apparently, the Arab states without peace are losing this tool. Now, with the election results in the US, new expectations raised in the region, obviously. It is anticipated from Biden administration to have a broader prospect towards the region. Rather than working with the above-mentioned axis, he is going to have, or personalizing relations with the prominent political actors of those countries, like President Trump did. Biden will have an institutionalized approach in the region, policy in the region. This is the expectation. I think it is for the both categories, and that's why maybe Pompeo speed up to pursue its policies in the region, and he made a visit to the region recently. And it is also hoped that Biden is going to revive the Middle East peace process, including the Palestinian side. Nevertheless, I would like to emphasize that the region is not the same region when Mr. Biden was vice president of Obama administration, and there is the legacy administration in the region. And I presume Biden will take for granted some part of this legacy, particularly with regard to the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, or the decision of moving U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, or the normalizing agreements. As Mr. Black pointed out, he will not be able to undo, or he will not undo, and they will stay there. However, this absolute unilateralism is expected to be abandoned by the new administration in the US. As we all know, Palestinians are in permanent state of urgency. The decades of occupation and blockade weakened their economic conditions as well as their critical infrastructure and health system. And evidently, the outbreak of COVID-19 has a huge hit on their socioeconomic conditions. There is a chronic shortage of medical supplies, hospitals, both in Gaza and West Bank. Apart from their daily grievances, there is obvious violation of international law as a result of decisions of American administration and Israeli government. The status of Jerusalem, the status of Masjid al-Aqsa, the recognition of Golan Heights as land of Israel, cutting financial support from UNRWA. These are all sorts of grave concerns. Unfortunately, while US and Israel were continuing to reach their goals in the region, the international community remained stagnant, although overwhelming majority of the international community objected the plans and decisions of US and Israel. Now it is time to set the clock when we had at least had a respect to the international law and the hundreds of UN resolutions, then to further develop a sustainable peace on the basis of justice, of course.
Yes. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ian Black's question is still pending. Mr. Azzam Tamimi wants to add something. Then I will give the floor to our three speakers. I also want to hear from Mr. Muasher because His Excellency was part of peace negotiations in 1990s, so he can also elaborate what kind of future is awaiting us. Please, Mr. Tamimi, we are looking for your answer.
Oh, thank you. Well, I would say just as it was unthinkable for the conflict in South Africa to be resolved without ending apartheid, it is unthinkable for permanent peace to be established in Palestine and the rest of the region so long as Zionism continues to be there. The idea of Zionism is that because you happen to be Jewish, you have the right to come to my own country, take my mother's house and my father's land and throw me out. God gave you a divine right to do this just because you happen to be Jewish. And I know that many Jews don't agree with this. There are many Jews who have opposed Zionism and continue to oppose Zionism. Because Zionism is just like apartheid, and it needs to be tackled. Yes, there can be a future whereby Jews, Muslims, Christians, and all others can live peacefully and coexist peacefully in the region, but that can never happen if one community considers itself to be superior and to have divine rights to dispossess the others, to kill them, to punish them, to violate their basic rights. So what I would say is that as Palestinians, we have to continue the struggle with whatever means we have against occupation, against apartheid Israel, against Zionism, until the balance of power shifts in our favor, and the world will see a shift similar to that happened in South Africa with the end of Zionism and the end of this racist regime called Israel.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tamimi. Let's go back to our speakers. Please, can you answer Mr. Ian Black's question? He asked if there is any workable strategy for one state, because it seems to be will be the main probably issues that we will be talking about in the next few years. So starting with Mr. Muasher and Mr. Ahmed Azem and Mr. Gideon Levy, that's the question from Mr. Black. Is there a workable strategy for one state solution?
Thank you, Laura. Ian, you asked a very important question, but I'm afraid that the question also needs to be asked in a different way. You ask if there is a workable strategy for a one-state solution. I want to ask today whether there is a workable strategy for a two-state solution. I claim that there isn't. There was once what the international community thought would be a workable solution, and that was the Oslo process. But the Oslo process did not freeze settlements, did not freeze the status quo. And today we find ourselves in a situation where the number of settlers, as Gideon said, has mushroomed from 250,000 when Oslo was signed in 1993 to 700,000 settlers today. The very concept of a two-state solution rests on a premise that you can separate the two communities. With 700,000 settlers, you cannot separate the two communities. On top of the fact that neither the Israeli government, nor the US government, nor the international community is serious about affecting a two-state solution. Passive support without putting in a plan to affect a two-state solution means nothing. And so I come back to your question. What is then a workable strategy to affect a one-state solution? Let us first, and I agree with Gideon completely here, we don't have to do anything. We are in a one-state reality today. If you do nothing, we are in a one-state reality today. The question is, how do you convert that one-state reality, that one-state apartheid reality, into a one-state democratic reality? The strategy becomes you ask for equal rights. And you keep asking for equal rights, and you keep struggling inside Palestine for equal rights. Because I am convinced today, and I'm somebody who has worked on a two-state solution for most of my career, I today believe strongly that the two-state solution is dead. It has been dead for over 10 years, and I've written that many times. And so the strategy becomes, you ask for equal rights, and there will come a time when the international community will no longer be able to say no to a Palestinian state and no to equal rights. The University of Maryland conducted a poll in 2018, a national poll in the US, and asked people this question: are you, in case there is no two-state solution, do you support equal rights for Palestinians, even if that means Israel will cease to exist as a Jewish state? The answer was 64% in 2018. Imagine what, and this is in the US, forget about the rest of the world. Imagine what the answer is going to be in 2030, when the Palestinians become 60% of the population. Who in the international community can say no to equal rights, you know, with a 60% majority? This is exactly where the trajectory is going to lead us. In my view, I will say this: forget the international community. It is not capable of solving the problem. Forget the Arab Peace Initiative. It is today dead. Forget the Oslo process. It is today dead. The only solution is going to be through a Palestinian struggle for equal rights in the coming years.
Thank you, Mr. Muasher. Before going to listen from Ahmed Azzam, there is a question for you, sir, from Hugh Lawant from European Council of Foreign Affairs. So we will get his question, and you can answer both of them. The floor is yours, Mr. Lawant.
Thank you. I mean, for what it's worth, I completely agree with what Marwan Muasher and Gideon Levy said. You know, I don't know whether two states is still achievable, will be achievable in 50 years. You know, who knows what kind of, what the political situation will look like, especially on the Israeli side. But I think what is clear is at the moment where we're at is an entrenching one-state reality, as we've heard being mentioned. And the question now is, if we are in this one-state reality, is it a one-state reality that is defined by inequality or equality? I don't think that necessarily needs to preclude a two-state solution further down the path when things change, but I think there needs to be acknowledgement of where we are at the moment. And so this brings me on to my question for Dr. Ahmed Azzam. So you've talked about the need for a paradigm shift, but you've still very much centered that on how to reconfigure negotiations and internationalization. But I think it's also clear, and I think you yourself kind of said this, is that I don't think we should over-expect from the Biden administration, and if they do engage, it may not be imminent, and certainly that's the message that's coming from them. And also more broadly, as we've heard, you know, I think the lesson from the last 27 years is that international negotiations have their limits. And I think it's quite clear that at this current time, the international community cannot be the game changer that Palestinians would like it to be. And I say this with regret as someone who's very much been in the trenches of international policy for at least 8 years. And so my question to you is kind of, what is the plan B? You know, what happens if internationalization fails? Or to be a bit more positive, what do we do while in the next 2 to 3 years while waiting for a Biden push? If we're not going to have negotiations next year, which I think is a likely bet given what the Biden administration is saying, what do Palestinians do in the meantime? And does that not put the onus on actually looking at domestic politics and rewriting the domestic situation? There's a blame game between Fatah and Hamas about who's blocking elections, but as the PA, is there not actually a reason to say that the PA should bounce the ball into Hamas's court and issue a presidential decree setting a date for elections and force Hamas to commit? And then my very brief second question is, on the normalization agreements, we've seen media reports that wine from Israeli settlements from the occupied Syrian Golan Heights is now being sold in the UAE. We've seen visits by the settler business community to the UAE, signing agreements or coming close to signing agreements with Emirati businessmen. So my question to you is, what is the Palestinian government doing in it to preclude settlers from benefiting from these agreements? And since the UAE is currently negotiating agreements with the Israeli government on trade and finance and other things, what are you doing as a Palestinian government to ensure that these agreements stop at the 1967 borders and don't include the Palestine and occupied territories? Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Azzam.
Thank you. Actually, the international community and Palestinians, everybody, maybe except the Israeli governments, invested in the two-state solutions. Palestinians needed a long time to accept this principle of having a state on 22% of Palestine. So knowing now that, yes, the reality on the ground is very difficult, I think now Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims are more than Israeli Jews between the Jordan River and the sea. So this is a reality, a apartheid reality. So I know when I say paradigm shift, what I meant paradigm shift is still in the context of negotiations and in the framework of two-state solutions, that the international community should stop asking for negotiations and peace process and have a clear parameters and a clear time framework to start a process under according to the multilateral framework. If not, yes, reality on the ground will create new facts. And let us remember that Palestinians are not only Palestinians living between the sea and river. There are millions of Palestinians who are refugees around the world, and also those, they have really a problem that cannot wait. Palestinian problem cannot wait that long, and in any moment we can see a new reality. The intifadas started in different times, can repeat itself. There is a lot of scenarios can happen because this situation is not sustainable. So I don't see really a mechanism of going back to Anne Black question. I don't see a mechanism for one state unless we have a clear change in the identity of the whole Israeli project, the whole Zionist project. If we are still asking for a Jewish state or a state for Jews, only for Jews, this will never make the one state position unless we can have a kind of process that can lead to change this idea to have the idea of a state for all its citizens. This is very important. Going back to the question of what we will do, what what is Plan B. Actually, on the ground, staying on the ground, steadfastness on the ground, having this government, Palestinian government, started last year before the coronavirus, a process of economic disengagement. We now need to emphasize about the agreements that Israel is not committing themselves for it. So I think the Plan B is to stay on the ground, which is Plan A actually, to stay on the ground, to re-empower our people. It is not only Fatah and Hamas; it's the whole PLO need to be recreated again. Need to be the new generations need to be included in the PLO, and to continue our national movement. It is really the option that we need to stick to. Regarding the question of companies, nevertheless, Arab companies or international companies investing in settlements and colonies, I think we already started a process of having a legal opinion and how to start to go into international courts legally to stop such processes. And we are clear. We sent messages that any such investments will not be accepted, and that there is legal consequences for this.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Azzam. It is obvious that most of the speakers and discussants here are aware of the fact that the paradigm of 1990s, 20s was hollow, as Mr. Levy put it. Now we are discussing a one-state solution, and how can it work? Is there a workable solution strategy? This is the question of Mr. Black. Mr. Levy, it is your turn now.
Thank you very much. To you, Mr. Blake, I would like to say that I came to the conclusion to the support of the one-state solution out of reduction. I think the two-state solution is a more simple solution. Both peoples deserve self-determination. One-state solution means really resetting everything, obviously leaving the idea of a Jewish state, of a Palestinian state, of Zionism. I mean, it's almost endless. And the two-state solution was, theoretically at least, the more simple and maybe the more just solution. The only problem is that this is blocked in an irreversible way. We have to realize that Israel, the settlers, had won on this, because the settlement project, which came to the world only to prevent creating a Palestinian state, has such achievements, and they are irreversible in my view. I wish I'm wrong. I wish I'm wrong. Now, you asked about a working plan or a plan for the. I think such a seminar, listen to the voices here. 5 years ago, you wouldn't hear those voices. I mean, 5 years ago, we all were stuck with the two-state solution. And we all knew somewhere in our hearts that it's not going to work. But we continued with this dynamics, as, by the way, the EU continues, and the PA continues, and the State Department continues, and Israel continues in a way. But the doubts about the viability of this solution become stronger and stronger, and this is already a starting point. As long as we continue to sing yesterday's song, the song for the two-state solution, this blocks any new thinking. And by the way, Israel is very interested in it, because by the end of the day, the only interest of Israel is maintaining the status quo, which is not the status quo, as we know, but while tripling the number of settlers and annexating it de facto. I mean, the annexation happened already. It's not that we have to discuss the annexation. It happened already on the ground. And you, Mr. Black, who have been here so many times and lived here, you know that the ground doesn't leave any room for a two-state solution. Now, the question is really, where do we go from here if there is a plan for this? I see all the difficulties, and they are enormous. It's really a reset of almost all the beliefs, all the ideologies. including the Zionistic one, including the Palestinian one. To leave it like Mr. Muasher suggested, just for the struggle of the Palestinians, I think is a little bit too romantic. The Palestinians are struggling now for 100 years. And now, when they are in their weakest point to believe that they will succeed more than in the last 100 years, we cannot leave it only for them, because unfortunately, they are very, very weak. And they by themselves will never achieve it, I'm afraid. I wish I'm wrong, but I'm afraid this is not the case. On the other hand, to believe that one shining day, the Israelis will wake up in the morning and say, oi, the occupation is not so nice, let's put an end to it. Or, oi, the Palestinians are human beings like us, let's give them equal rights. This will not happen. The Israelis are living very much in peace with the occupation, with the brutality, with denying this, but they couldn't care less. Tel Aviv doesn't care at all about the occupation and will not care about the occupation until Tel Aviv will start to pay for it, until Tel Aviv will be punished for it, and then Tel Aviv will ask, Tel Aviv will ask, are we ready to pay this price? For what? For those settlers? For this piece of land that we have never been to? What for? Why? So here comes the role of the world. I am not sure that the Palestinians can get there by themselves. And the role of the world until now was not fulfilled. As I said before, talking is not enough and will never be enough. But maybe there will be a point in which the world will really put some pressure on Israel. It never happened. But maybe there will be a point in which there will be no other choice but putting this pressure, because pressure can bring to results. In the same time, we have to start to talk about this new concept of one state, like we do here. Among Palestinians, by the way, Mr. Black, there is more agreement for this than among Jews in Israel. But I must tell you that in the recent years, it's less of a taboo. Until 2-3 years ago, it was a taboo even to mention it in Israel. Not that I think that there is a majority or we are reaching even a meaningful minority for this, but at least it is somehow legitimate to mention it. And you know, as I think it was Marwan who mentioned it, in South Africa, it was unthinkable until the early 90s. Who believed? It was totally unthinkable. A democracy in South Africa, nobody believed in it. I know there are big differences because the proportions are different, very different, and it will be much harder here, but we have to start, and we have some pilots. Look, Jerusalem is a pilot. And now recently Israel declared, I mean, they were forced to declare that they will give citizenship to young Palestinians between the age of 18 and 22. They have no other choice, those who ask for citizenship. You know, Jerusalem, with all its difficulties, and the occupation is present in Jerusalem like any other place, but still something is going on between the two peoples. I don't live there, and I hate going there, but I must tell you that people who live there tell me that there is beginning of a new reality on the ground, not politicians, but on the ground. Yet not an equal one and not a just one, but things are happening between the two peoples in Jerusalem. Jerusalem can be a pilot if we will give citizenship to all the East Jerusalemites, to all the Palestinians living in Jerusalem. This can be a beginning. It will not be easy, it will take decades, but we have to start somewhere, because continuing to speak about the two-state solution, meaning continuing to support the occupation. There is no other way to phrase it.
Okay, thank you, Gideon. It was a very detailed explanation. At the same time, we have to realize that the left wing, the peace camp in Israel is very weak. I used to get mails from late Uri Amneri. After he passed away, I don't see someone who could replace, or a very weak voice from Israel. When it comes to Palestinian equal rights, as Mr. Muasher put it, maybe we should go to Professor Bardal Aral. He worked on human rights issues and also Palestinian rights. Can you also share your views, Mr. Professor, with us about equal rights, which would support maybe a one-state solution in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Bora Bayraktar. I think the main problem about the Palestinian issue is that the issue of Palestinians is something that's not being discussed in the context of international law. We are discussing it as something that's political, basically. That the Israel, the state of Israel, and the Palestinians should somehow establish a peaceful coexistence, and Israel is going to be more tolerant of the rights of the Palestinians. But to be frank, I think we have to face the reality that the oppressor and the aggressor, aggressor will never leave aggression, will never abandon its gained occupation. Israelis, they think that, they defeated the Palestinians, and they rightly deserve to have sovereignty in those areas. So, international sets in here. A United Nations system is very important. Of course, we know that the United Nations Security Council will never punish, take any punitive action against Israel. We know that. But at least United Nations General Assembly could be, I think, mobilized under the rubric of the Uniting for Peace powers. They could impose sanctions against Israel. Economic sanctions, political sanctions, financial sanctions, military sanctions could be imposed. The speakers have mentioned about the case of South Africa. Without the international pressure, without the United Nations Security Council, without the General Assembly and the International Court of Justice, there would be no possibility, really, to dismantle this apartheid system, the racist system, and the mistreatment of the non-white people in South Africa. So I think in recent years we have come to a stage where we discuss things only through a political perspective, as though there's no international law for Palestinians. Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, and the world saw the most monstrous sanctions against Iraq, in addition to the military action, enforcement action by the US and its allies against Iraq. So why don't we think about these punitive actions against Israel? Gideon Levy has mentioned that the Israelis will never, really, most of them, will never accept to share the territory with the Palestinians, because they think, they defeated the Palestinians, they occupied it, and because it's God-given to them. So why should they sacrifice their gains? So we need to have international pressure, basically, in order to ensure that the Palestinians have their rights. So I think this normalization process is not assisting this process. Normalization is basically the message given to the state of Israel by the Arabs. Some of the Arab states, let's say, that you can do anything you like, no problem. And we don't take the Palestinian problem seriously. We think that the Palestinian problem is something that is secondary. But we want to establish, a peace with you, and we want to develop our relations, especially on security front. But such normalization is, I think, problematical in many ways. First, you accept, illegal moves by the state of Israel. You accept it as legitimate in the area. You don't really provide any rights for the Palestinians. And you actually give the message that the Palestinian right of self-determination could be sacrificed. The Camp David Treaty. Camp David Treaty is claimed by many scholars, including myself, that it's illegal in the context of the Palestinian rights, because Camp David sacrificed Palestinian rights at the expense of in order for the Egyptians and the Israelis to make peace. But the right of the Palestinian people was sacrificed because it only provided for autonomy for the Palestinians. So this Arab position at the moment is really a backward position, a position that really deviates from international law and legality. So basically, I think this normalization is very problematical. Besides, the normalization process is something that's done among the political elites. It does not involve the people. The people of the region, they don't want any normalization with Israel. And we should not forget that normalization is not only recognition. Normalization is the will to establish normal diplomatic relations. But I tell you, the front states of the South Africa during the apartheid system in the 1970s, 80s, they did not normalize their relations with the state of South Africa, this racist state, until the apartheid system was dismantled. They did not normalize relations with South Africa, although they already recognize it as a state, of course. But we don't see the same thing in the context of the Arab Gulf states. They have shown themselves willing to be partners of the state of Israel simply because they want to remain in power. We are in a stage in which many of the Gulf states, they think that the only way they can remain in power is through the Israeli and American support. They have really dissociated themselves from the people. All the public opinion surveys indicate, all those public opinion surveys indicate that the Arab peoples think that the greatest threat to peace in the Middle East is the United States and Israel, basically. And so, ignoring this reality and trying to consider Israel, although it's an oppressive, aggressive, and racist state, that it's a normal state, that we can normalize relations with this state, is really problematical. The speakers have mentioned that the two-state solution is illusion. I agree with that personally. It's illusion. But one state is also, if one state is going to be dominated by the Zionist state, then there is no point to talk about one state. Israelis have to understand that they are an occupying state. That's an aggressive state, a racist state, and they cannot normalize with the people of the region. And the Palestinian problem is actually the root of all the problems, the mother of all problems in the area. So they have to, I think, confront the reality of aggression and illegality. So all this process leading to normalization, I think, is a kind of undermining the possibility of true peace and justice in the area. And interestingly, I think we have to notice another thing. The more Turkey becomes more engaged with the Palestinian rights, the more the Arab world seems to have a kind of, a cold feeling, a kind of feeling of tension against Turkey. And it's really interesting. And the same applies for Iran and possibly for other states. And Qatar, for instance, because it has one of the reasons why they have imposed, the Gulf states imposed a deadly blockade, is because Qatar is not sharing the same perspective as some of the other Gulf states, which seek to normalize relations with Israel and which seeks to support the rights of the Palestinians. So I think in this debate, we have to consider international as the main center of discussion, basically.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your statement. International law should be the base of solution, is the main message of yours. So we have a few guests here who never spoken, Mr. Rabbani, Mr. Ziber, and Alan Tartir. So I will give you the floor for you. Please limit your speeches with 3 minutes. Start with Mr. Rabbani and then Ziber and Mr. Tartir.
Thank you. It never ceases to amaze me that in the 21st century and under current circumstances, discussions about Palestine tend to very quickly focus almost exclusively on the question of one versus two states, as if we're massing at the gates of Tel Aviv and need to urgently resolve this issue by tomorrow morning. I compare it, for Palestinians to be debating this issue under the current circumstances, I've always compared it to a condemned man spending the night before his execution, agonizing over whether to spend his next summer on the French or Italian Riviera. It just doesn't make sense. I'd like to make a few brief points. The first is that I think it's wrong to conflate the Oslo process with the two-state framework. I don't think Oslo was ever about ending the occupation. and establishing an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. Secondly, I do think there is a very clear strategy for achieving a one-state solution. I think, in fact, it's the only strategy for achieving it. And that is a decisive military victory over Israel, because I don't think there are non-military avenues to achieving a one-state solution, a civil rights struggle, a political struggle, and so on. I mean, a one-state solution basically requires the disestablishment of Zionism and its institutions and so on. And I don't see how this can be achieved without a decisive military victory. One more point. There is an international consensus. We may not like it, but it exists. And that is for a two-state settlement. Now, if we're going to pursue a one-state solution, I think we need to either have the capacity to transform the international consensus, which may happen under different circumstances, or we have to be able to act unilaterally despite that international consensus. And the Palestinians at present don't have the capacity to do either. As a final point, I think it would be much more useful for such discussions in 2020 to focus on what some speakers have correctly described as the extraordinary, and I would add existential weakness of the Palestinians, and to focus on ways that they can rebuild their national movement and once again become a relevant political factor. I think that the real issue now is that the Palestinians are in the process of being transformed from a meaningful political actor to a politically insignificant demographic reality. And recent developments in the Middle East serve to only confirm that. And therefore, I think the discussion should be focused on how Palestinians can salvage, rebuild, replace, whatever, the national movement, and seek to once again take the political initiative. Then one can talk about either finding ways to implement the international consensus or to transform it. But I think to have that debate in 220 is premature to the point of being irresponsible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rabbani. Especially existential weakness of Palestinians is the expression that I underline. So let's hear Mr. Zilber from Washington Institute of Near East Studies. The floor is yours, sir. Please limit with 3 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind invitation to take part in this panel. I'll just say, I mean, I think from my sense, there's been a lot of, shall we say, revisionist history has come up over the past hour and a half in terms of Zionist history or the history of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and other matters. But that aside, I will agree up to a point that the current trajectory here in Israel and Palestine is very much headed towards a one-state reality for all the reasons mentioned at the top in terms of settlement construction and the inertia, I would say, especially amongst the Israeli public and political class, for any kind of maybe forward positive movement. And then you add that as well with what Mr. Muasher rightly pointed out at the top as well, which was essentially a reversal of the Arab Peace Initiative, which was really a lever and this carrot that was held out to entice the Israeli public and by extension their political leaders for territorial concessions and withdrawal primarily on the West Bank. And you take that away and it only solidifies the Israeli rights narrative that we don't have to do anything and concessions are not required. However, I would say that I'm not as despondent about the prospect of a two-state solution. This might sound a bit counterintuitive given the reality on the ground and just the history of the past, let's say, decade in terms of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. But I am more optimistic for one reason, which is that the threat, and we'll call it a threat, the threat of a one-state reality, where Palestinians demand equal rights in one political framework, one political state, I think will have an impact in the Israeli debate. So, in other words, the best way, and perhaps the only way, to get to a two-state reality is precisely to threaten a one-state reality. And I don't like the language used by my friend Gideon Levy. Tel Aviv needs to be punished, but the Israeli public very much needs to, let's say, internalize the reality on the ground, and it's sleepwalking towards the end of the Zionist project and the Jewish state. And I think that in and of itself could have let's say, a positive impact in terms of any shift in the Israeli political appetite for an end to the occupation, for territorial concessions, genuine territorial concessions. And so I wouldn't dismiss the two-state idea precisely for that reason. And for all those, especially on this panel, touting a one-state reality, I would just pose the question, and feel free to answer in the time remaining, that point to one example, especially in the Middle East, of a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious state, especially under a democratic framework, that has not devolved into violence and civil strife. And so I think the future of a one-state reality, if it were to come to pass, would be civil war, civil strife, with the need at the other end of it for partition, i.e. a two-state solution. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Zuber. Let's hear Mr. Tartir from Al Shabaka. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the panel and for the invitation to speak as well and intervene. I think the main question was raised actually by Mr. Levy, which is, will the world live with a second apartheid state? And I think this is an important question to have. And unfortunately, the answer, as we know by now, is yes. So far, the world accepted to live with a second state of apartheid. And not only that, they also accepted to live with the settler colonial project. And these two crimes are very clearly identified crimes, and it's easy to notice them. And the question, therefore, in my opinion, should be, how can we make it unbearable to the international community and unacceptable to accept that these conditions of Israeli apartheid and Israeli settler colonialism? Clearly, international law is not enough, and clearly politics overrule international law. So the question is, what kind of accountability mechanisms and accountability framework can we have in place to ensure that the international community will not be able and willing to live with these conditions? Clearly, waiting for time, like waiting 10 years, 20 years, is not the solution. Palestinians have waited so long, and any extra day of waiting will be a loss for current and future generations. So that's the question, how to make accountability mechanisms in place, enforce them, and what are the tools that we have in order to push the international community to reject the ideas of apartheid and settler colonialism. My second point relate, as we heard a lot so far, we're talking, especially from a Palestinian perspective here, we're talking about internationally pleasing paradigms and thinking and exercise and strategies. And I think it's enough of that. It is time to look for inward dynamics for once. And now we have a golden opportunities with the Biden administration, not to run after the US administration and to tell them we're ready to do business, but rather to take a step back and engage in inward-looking dynamics, precisely to revive and reclaim and rebuild the Palestinian national project. Because simply going back to the old normal that Biden administration will bring to the table is not good news, neither for peace, nor for justice, nor for equal rights. It will be a continuation of what we've seen before with the old normal. So from a Palestinian leadership point of view and perspective, the priority should not be on how to revive the relationship with Israel and with the United States, but rather how to rebuild the internal Palestinian dynamics. Clearly, the current Palestinian leadership and other leaderships are neither interested nor willing to do that. The final point is that I just want to bring to the table here is that we didn't really talk about other actors like the European Union. I argue that the European Union and European countries are so relieved at the moment with Biden in office because they are off the hook. They don't have to be an active player. They are happy with their comfort zone of being a payer only. And they are really relieved that they don't need to do that anymore. They need only to re-engage with the process for the sake of re-engaging with that when Biden administration decides to revive it through economic peace framework. So to conclude, I think talking about peace at the moment is really delusional, misleading, unattainable, and irresponsible. And I'm saying this because there are so many prerequisites before even talking about peace that we need to tackle and engage with. And then we can talk about peace, we can talk about one state, we can talk about two states, and so on. But the important task for all of us is how do we deal with the prerequisites that in front of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tartir. Yeah, I agree with you. We are talking about, we are not talking about a just peace, but we are talking about a viable solution, obviously. We have one question from Mustafa Fatih Yavuz of TRT World. Then I'll give the floor for our three speakers to make their final remarks. Yes, Fatih.
Thank you very much for everyone, and I also want to thank TRT World Forum team who allowed us to be here and asking questions to this in this panel. First of all, I want to comment about the normalization of Arab countries with Israel. I've been following this issue, and I've been following Palestine-Israeli issues since 2017 from occupied East Jerusalem. And I think I want to criticize one thing. I believe that we are so state-centric in our comments, and also we are so power-centric in our comments. And I want to give it a type of analysis from conflict resolution. There is a notion called mutually hurting stalemate from Thomas Schelling's. And it's basically saying that both parties can only reach an agreement if they both hurted, if they feel hurted. In this case, we don't see a hurted Israel. In that case, I can say that what Gideon Levy basically saying that Tel Aviv should be punished is, I think he meant there should be a balance of power. There is no balance of power between Palestinians and Israelis. And from the normalization perspective, Palestinians had one card that they can use to push Israel to the corner for two-state solution, which is the quantity. Middle East is still an Arab-dominated place. When we look at in the past, there is a theory saying that the source of militarism in the Middle East comes from the defeat of Arab countries in 1948 war. So basically, from normalization, what I understand that those Gulf countries want to secure their regimes. That's why they wanted to have an agreement with Israel, just to send a message to Washington that we are friends of yours, just to save their regimes. And from that perspective, I want to say that we should still believe the Arab world. I think Arab world can change the situation, can bring the peace. I'm not saying that Israel should be punished in a different way. I'm just saying that Arab world can change it. And I think Arab Spring showed something, but it turned something else. And from the Gulf countries' perspective, those people living in the Gulf countries, especially when we look at the situation Al-Aqsa compound, I'm just living 1 or 2 kilometers away from it. If you want to go into Al-Aqsa compound and if you want to pray there, first you have to be checked by Israeli police. And I have to say that in a way, Israel is also occupying Al-Aqsa compound. That's why I want to ask Mr. Muasher regarding Al-Aqsa issue and normalization. So I want to ask, Jordan is the custodian of Al-Aqsa compound, and we see a normalization, and we talked about one-state solution. Let's say there is a one-state solution. I have doubts about it also because I know some Israelis, including Ehud Olmert, who wants two-state solution because they really care about Israel's Jewish character. They believe that if there's one state solution, there won't be a Jewish state. Let's say that there is a one state and Israel trying to occupy or just change the status quo of Al-Aqsa compound. And all of the Middle East, I believe that it can happen because what I see from the Palestinians that after Donald Trump declared something in favor of Israel, Palestinians, especially in the occupied Jerusalem, didn't react it. But when something happened for Al-Aqsa, they did it. I've seen lots of protests. Okay. I believe that Al-Aqsa has a potential to maybe stir up a kind of protests in the Middle East. How would react if Israel change the status quo of Al-Aqsa compound in the future? Do you believe that it can steer a kind of round of uprisings in the Middle East, especially, I have to say, in Jordan, because we know that there are lots of Palestinians living there? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fatih. With this question, Mr. Muasher, please make your final remarks. You have 4 to 5 minutes. Then I'll ask Mr. Levy to make his final remarks. As a Palestinian, I want to give the last word to Mr. Ahmed Azzam. So please use your time.
There were a number of very important issues that were raised. Let me take in particular one issue that I disagree with, which is several speakers have said that the Palestinians are at their weakest today. I don't agree with that at all. Unless we mean by the Palestinians the PA and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, then yes, I agree. But these are not the only Palestinians. Let us remember the Palestinians inside Israel. They've never been stronger than today. Today you have 15 members in the Knesset that are united in an Arab United List, and they are the ones leading the fight for equal rights. It's not the PA which is leading the fight for equal rights today. It is the Palestinians inside Israel. Today, the Palestinians inside Israel are 5 times the number of the Labour Party, 5 times the number of the of Meretz inside Israel. It's a long way from where they were, in 1948. So we should not keep thinking of the Palestinians as the PA. You have 6.9 million Palestinian Arabs living in the areas under Israel's control today, whether they are in Israel proper, in the West Bank and Gaza, or East Jerusalem, or Jerusalem in total, versus 6.6 million Israeli Jews. Today, the Palestinians are a majority. Yes, they don't have a majority in I don't want to say in the Knesset, because I don't think that we are going for one state in which Israel maintains, as we know it today, maintains the upper hand. We want to deconstruct, in my view, the Israeli concept of a state today and reconstruct it. And I think I agree with Gideon here. Reconstruct it on the basis of equal rights. And today, let me say again, it is the Palestinians inside Israel who are leading the fight, and leading it very effectively, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muasher. Mr. Levy, your final remarks.
I was convinced that the occupation cannot last forever. That one day it will explode in the face of Israel. History tells us that finally empires and colonialists don't last forever. And this was a source of hope. But the longer this period goes, the older we become. I start to be afraid, and that's maybe the biggest danger to the whole project that we are talking about. I start to believe that there is also a possibility that the status quo of the last 53 years will last at least another 53 years, and maybe even 530 years. Look at Tibet, look at the Native Americans in the United States. There are peoples who lost it and lost their chance. And there are empires who won. And there are colonialist countries who finally succeeded to maintain the status quo. So that's the biggest danger, because I feel a sense of fatigue by the world. I feel a sense of despair among the Palestinians, and I feel obviously a lot of despair and indifference in Israel from any chance of any kind of a solution. And we are pulled into this reality in which we'll say, no, we don't have a solution. It's without solution. It will stay like this forever. This is the biggest challenge in front of us, not to surrender and not to give up, because right now we are not in a very good time when, as I say, yes, Marwan, you are very right about the strengthening of the Israeli Palestinians, the Israeli Arabs, but the Palestinian as a people, as a political entity, are in one of their lowest points, while Israel is stronger than ever. This must be also said. The world practically accepted the occupation. Yes, there are all the resolutions of all the international institutions, but the world never did anything about it. It took few weeks for the EU to put sanctions over Russia, big and strong Russia, after the invasion to Crimea. And it took 53 years for the EU to do nothing, to label the products from the settlements, which is nothing, hollow. So we should, I really think that forms like this give hope, because all of a sudden we are using a new language. We almost all agreed about it. And this by itself gives some kind of hope that maybe we are starting something new, because one thing is very clear. All the old methods that we tried, and by the way, the Palestinians tried them all. They tried diplomacy, they tried violence, they tried justice, anything. Nothing brought them any further, and they really tried everything. We cannot leave them by their own, because, as I say, they are too lonely. I think the world has a moral duty toward the Palestinians, including Europe, by the way, including even Germany, who is always so hesitating to criticize Israel. They all have some kind of moral duty, moral debt toward the Palestinian people, because everything that happened was finally on the account of these people who lived here for hundreds of years, and the Palestinians living under occupation, this is my last sentence, are, as far as I know, the only people in the world who does not have any kind of citizenship of any state. Think about it. People without any citizenship. I mean, part of them are Jordanian citizens, but not all of them. The majority of them don't possess any citizenship. This cannot go on forever. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Levy. And your final words, Mr. Azem, please.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Mouin Rabbani and Ala Tartir that the question of one state, two state solutions, maybe it should not take that much attention from our discussion. I think it's important to question, but however, what is happening on the ground, occupation on the ground, settlements, other aspects of the problem we live is much more urgent, I think, especially that PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, let us remember, proposed this solution of one-state solutions as early as 1969. There is now infrastructure, legal infrastructure, as a United Nations resolutions and other initiatives that supporting the two-state solutions. Anyway, Palestinians are, as I mentioned, they are ready to have one-state, two-state solutions. We are looking for a solution. Just commenting on the idea that Oslo never been seen as part of finding a state or no, Oslo actually not defending Oslo, but Oslo was about to end occupation. If Israel actually committed itself to Oslo, Oslo was a possibility to end the occupation. Commenting on Mr. Levy, Jeroen Levy idea of that Jerusalem can be a pilot for the solution, I think Mr. Levy is meaning that can be in the future a pilot, something imagined, but not the current Jerusalem. Jerusalem with all these hundreds of thousands of housing units dedicated only for Israel's, while demolishing Palestinians, demolishing Palestinian houses, preventing them from building their own houses, checkpoints in the Palestinian neighborhoods. This is the current Jerusalem. I think Israel must pay a price for the occupation. If it is not paying a price, there will not be a solution. The price is not necessarily only by states. I think intellectually. So while we are Palestinians face every day with challenge, with questions from EU governments and other governments about our textbooks, about our media, I think people, intellectuals, university academics, media people around the world should start questioning the whole Israeli discourse of having one state for one single religious group, raising the question of about their textbooks, about what is happening in universities. There are universities now in settlements. We should have a kind of a position on this. Also commenting on the idea of that Palestinians are weak and that the weakness now it's in the highest. No, I don't think the comparison between Palestine and the native people in America or elsewhere is a valid one. We are the majority on the ground in terms of numbers. We are a people who is 13, 14 million people around the world. Actually, the infrastructure that started the Palestinian national project in the 1950s and 1960s, it is not still there only, but it is also more stronger now, which is the people. The Palestinian people are well-educated people. They can preserve their identity. They can start there, or they can renew their national project again. And I think, yes, we have problems in terms of our political institutions and many things. Even PA, Dr. Marwan, I cannot say that it is really that much show this weakness. I think even the BA and can is playing a vital role in steadfastness on the ground, and it can develop, and I think it will develop its plans for economic disengagement, many things. Actually, when we are saying Israeli occupation, look, Israel is not only getting the support of governments. When some intellectuals, when some media people, when some actually even popular movements started to speak about BDS as anti-Semitism, this is a problem. So we have not only officially, also intellectuals and people, popular movements around the world, a clear goal to say that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism, that we should question all the intellectual basis, all the philosophy of Zionism as building an entity or a state for one single group of belief or a religious group. I think if we can manage to redesign all of this, this is a paradigm shift that we needed really. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Azem. Thank you very much for all of our speakers and discussants. I think it was a very good discussion, updating, refreshing, and preparing ourselves for the next decade. Again, thank you very much for joining this TRT World Forum Session 1. Thank you all, and have a nice time and have a good forum. Thank you.